It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Lat Blaylock, a dear friend and a fantastic asset to the RE community in this country, I'd just like to say. Lat was a teacher for 12 years before becoming a national RE advisor, and he's been a national RE advisor for 20 years, and we're really looking forward to hear what he has to say about supporting the spiritual life in our schools. So I'm going to hand over to him now.
Olivia, thank you very much. First of all, fantastic to be with you. And would you notice, please, that what's happening in this church today, 100 and some people who make prayer spaces in schools happen, that may do more for the spiritual life of schools than what happens in a whole lot of staff meetings. And schools desperately need you. If you're here as a teacher, a head teacher today, or a Christian visitor to schools, or if you're here as a chaplain or a minister, a vicar, then actually notice that schools desperately need people who are willing just to work forward from where they are with their descriptions and definitions of spirituality, whatever they may be, to work forward with those, with children and young people. And I'm wholly inspired, immensely impressed by the work that goes under this big, broad banner, Prayer Spaces in Schools. Something extraordinary has happened there in just a few years, and I just think that's fantastic, and I'm full of delight that it's happening. Pleased to be with you because actually I think that there's something about what I do, religious education, and what happens in prayer spaces in schools that is vitally connected, and I think that connection is around the concept of spirituality. And what I'm going to do, I've got about 30 minutes to do this with you. What I'm going to do is just take a little look at some of the sources of spiritual life that we find in schools and have a think about how those might have an impact on what we're playing at with prayer spaces in schools. I think it's really important that what we're talking about here is prayer. And would you notice and remember that actually I'd like to refocus the work of prayer spaces in schools. What's it really all about? Post-it notes or talking to God? Actually, it's all about talking to God, listening to God, spending time with God. And the idea of prayer spaces in schools is actually to open up space to be what all space is. There's no space that isn't the presence of God. In Christian understanding, there's no space where God cannot be encountered. And actually, in a school, every space could be where what Prayer Spaces in Schools has discovered is there are some ways of just focusing that nice and sharply that actually seem to help children to see what it is to speak with God or to listen to God. So I'm interested there, and I think a part of what we might be thinking about today is a kind of theology of prayer. And then I think we might also be thinking about a theology of education, and we might be focusing that around spirituality. Notice too, would you please, that I said that you're from many different backgrounds. Some of you head teachers, some of you teachers, some of you youth workers, some of you Christian ministers, a huge variety. I'm telling you here what's going to happen to you when you die. That when you arrive in the heavenly portals, a middle-ranking angel will come up to you and say, I understand you have some experience with young people. We do have needs in that area here. Because you see, there's no Christian community in the whole of the UK, I think, that has enough people to go and do the things that we know need to be done to nurture the next generation in Christian faith, in Christian discipleship, and actually also in human spirituality. There's three categories for you, okay? Christian faith, Christian discipleship, human spirituality. And actually, what the churches mostly do is they put whatever resources they have into nurturing Christian faith and Christian discipleship for the, I'm sorry folks, really few children, the tiny proportion of children who walk through the door into a church. But what Prayer Spaces in Schools is doing is offering to nurture the human spirituality of every child. And they nearly all go to school. They are there in their high numbers. 650,000 5-year-olds, 650,000 6-year-olds, every age group right through to 16, slightly fewer 17 and 18-year-olds, but they're all in school. And what a shocking shame it is that over the last 40 years, the capacity of the churches in the UK to have any influence or dialogue with children and young people has fallen and fallen and fallen. And one of the things that I delight in about prayer spaces is that it's doing a reverse to some of that. And it's making it possible for the Christian community to make some sort of offer of nurture in human spirituality, not just in Christian faith and Christian nurture for those who come through the door of our churches and chapels, but to every child. They are all in school. That's good. Now, when you talk about spirituality, of course, what you can do is disappear up the debate. So actually, let me neutralise that a little bit this morning and tell you what I mean when I say today spirituality, and see if you find that description at all helpful. I think if you look for a description of Christian spirituality, then you look to the Bible and you look to the life and teaching and example of Jesus. And Christian spirituality is distinctively about things like grace and forgiveness. And there's no Christian spirituality, I think, without forgiveness. Those are key themes in Christian spirituality. But that definition and description is not necessarily helpful to us in school. We'll carry it with us as Christian people. But I think we need a description of the spiritual for humanity if we're going to work in schools. Because schools, God bless them and God love them, as they are, they're vastly plural. Schools are Christian and Hindu, Muslim and Sikh, Jewish and Buddhist, atheist and agnostic. And that's the staff and the pupils, and it's the mission of the school. That's the way they should be. So actually, we need a description of the spiritual, which works for any human. You don't have to be a Christian to sign up to this one. And I'm immensely grateful to Dr. David Hay and Dr. Rebecca Nye, respectively from Nottingham University and Cambridge University, who have done fantastic work in this area. Up to 30 years ago, they were describing the spiritual in ways that make sense for every human being. And their description says, well, let's look at spirituality as relational consciousness. That is, how aware you are of the relationships that you're a part of. And let's think of spirituality in 4 ways. Actually, your spirituality is about how you relate to yourself. That's one set of relationships, your inner life. Some people see that as the main thing, don't they? They say, oh, your inner life, that's really where your spirituality happens. It's what goes on in your own heart. Myself, I think that's only that can be a narrowing thing. If your spirituality doesn't have much impact on how you relate to others, then I'm not sure it's worth much. So actually, that inward relationship is important, but not the whole story. And then there's how you relate to others. And actually, for some people in Britain today, if you notice that a lot of people, if you ask them about their religious and spiritual life, the thing that matters most to them is who they love. And actually, if you love your parents, or if you love your children, or if you love your partner, if you love your lover, if you love whoever you love, and that is the mainspring of how you live, and that's the mainspring of the challenge to unselfish living that you have in your life, then that's a relating to others kind of spirituality, isn't it? And I recognize that very much myself, that actually the things that in the end matter most to me are probably pretty much tied up with 3 people called Rosamond, Abby, and Luke, my partner and my 2 children. My spirituality, my spiritual life is tied up with my relationships. But then actually Hay and Nye say that how you relate to the ground on which you stand, to the planet you live on, to the earth which supports you, that's an aspect of spirituality too. I've been taught that by people much younger than me, okay? I was taught that by people who were born 20 or 30 years after I was born. But have you noticed as well the green spiritualities that are growing at the moment? In Britain today, some sense of the sanctity, shall we use that word? The sanctity of the earth is being refreshed in the Christian communities so that we see the spiritual life that treads upon the earth in ways that respect the ground that God made. And we see the spiritual life, it's always been there in some ways in Christianity, but sometimes it's been a bit trodden over and not really attended to. I think there's a green dimension to human spirituality, and I actually think my generation has messed up on that, and the next generation is doing just a little better. I'm pleased to see it because they need to. And actually, if you think of that, my spiritual life is how I relate within, how I relate to others, how I relate to the ground, the earth on which I stand. Then, of course, the 4th dimension of that, well, what word shall we use for that? In the Christian community, we can easily say that's about the spirituality that relates to God, the spirituality that is to do with your relationship with God in Christ. Fine. In human spirituality terms, in the mixed school community, perhaps we'll do better to find some other word for that. So I reached for the word transcendent, and after all, I did some undergraduate study of biblical studies and theology, so I'm happy with words like that. That's one of my top words. I like it, transcendent. And then I think I'm not using that actually with year 4s, Let's talk instead about the big beyond. That works quite nicely, doesn't it? So I don't know quite how you'll say that, but the fourth dimension that Hay and Nye identify of spiritual life is how you relate to the big beyond, to God, to the ultimate, to the transcendent. If you've got a better one than those four words, then pop it in there, okay? And notice how simple that is, actually. You can have a school staff meeting which discusses what is spirituality, and it spends, a good fortnight getting nowhere. But actually, this way of describing the spiritual for any human, any child, every child, might work very, very widely. It's how I relate to myself, to others, to the earth, and to the big beyond. That's helpful. Now, I want you to keep that in mind as we go through the next few minutes, because actually, one of my first contentions here is that the children are doing it already. And I know that because Cameron Conroy, age 9, was asked to write a poem on the theme, Windows on the Soul, and he wrote this: "If there was a window on my soul, I want to see my blaze and faith. It will be like sleeping on a warm, warm beach. I think my soul is hot blaze. When you visit my soul, you will get free, warm bread. And I have faith in my soul." Now, just notice there that Cameron does not need me, who likes the word transcendent, to tell him what spirituality means. He's 9, so he knows. He's human, so he gets it. We asked John Archer, aged 11, to use the same title for his poem. And he wrote this one: "Window to your soul. Your soul has a window. It is wobbly and unstable, so you can't see through. God, the handyman, if you trust in him, he cements it in, so you can see him standing at the door. And all of you Revelation chapter 3 readers and quoters may imagine that John has got that in his head, and maybe he has, I can't tell, I don't know. But I know what he's got in his head and his heart, that he's got a spiritual life of his own. And actually, this is important for us as we think about serving the spiritual life of any school, is that the first thing is, highly likely, that 100% of children in school have got something which I would describe as their spiritual life, that is about how they relate to themselves and to others, to the earth on which they stand, and to the big beyond. And it's going on already. Nothing much necessarily to do with church, or indeed mosque, or synagogue. The spiritual life is often found in the playground, as it is in the sacred space, the space that's labelled sacred. The spiritual life that is as often found in the impulse to unselfishness, or in the quiet reflection of a moment taken. The spiritual life of children and young people is there, and when we go looking for it, then we find it. Here's another. I just need to get down to tell you this one because I can't read it. This is by Florence Ward, who is 10. When you look to your soul, to your heart, what do you see? Love or hate, confidence or prejudice? If there was a window to your soul, all your feelings would be free for the world to see. Would you be proud of them or simply disappointed? When you think, truly think, thoughts come from your heart rather than your brain. When you look to your soul, you will see your true personality. Use your opportunity to shine. Look to your soul and see whoever you want to be. Notice I've got 3 youngsters there. Actually, one of them secondary age. John Archer is 11 in year 7, the other 2 from primary school, giving 3 very different ideas arising from the window on your soul. And because I'm a religious educator, that's what I do, okay? These have happened in RE lessons. They come from a competition we run called Spirited Poetry, where children write poems in religious education lessons. And if, like me, you're rather impressed by the spiritual depth of what these children have expressed in those 3 bits of poetry, then please notice that one of the things Prayer Spaces in schools does is to give children time for thinking, for personal reflection, time for personal expression. Religious education lessons, sometimes, when they're really good, they do that as well. Now, I want to take particularly a look at how children and young people think of prayer. And I want you to notice here that theologies of prayer, which the Christian community has got a fair few of those, we've got quite a wide range of theologies of prayer, I want you to notice that some of those in some ways are connected and reflected in what children express when they express their deepest ideas about prayer carefully and thoughtfully. And when you've seen 5 examples of what children's theologies of prayer are like, then I hope that will be provocative for you, and it will help you to see that when you set up your paddling pool and your bubble tube and your crystal ball, and when you set up your 300 post-it note activity with a world map, and these are all great things, let's have 100,000 ideas like this so that the range of what happens at prayer spaces in schools can be ever widening and continuously enlarging. When you set those up, what you're actually after in the end is for young people to make a connection with, shall I still say, the big beyond, with God through prayer. So we asked pupils to create a work of art which inquired into a question about prayer, and the first one looks like this. The scan isn't brilliant here, but actually when you see what Imogen and Bethany, both 5, said, then you'll see the value of their theology of prayer. Our art in heaven work shows our hands praying. The patterns are different languages because God listens to all languages. Now this afternoon, I have to speak to you again a little bit, and this afternoon I'll say a bit about working as Christians in the multi-faith and multi-belief context that is education today. But actually the first thing I notice here is that Imogen and Bethany are happy to celebrate diversity when they think of prayer. And that's really good for us. That will lead us. A lot of this is about being led by the children, okay, because that's a nice biblical idea. So if a 5-year-old can lead your spiritual practice as someone who runs prayer spaces in schools, then notice what Imogen and Bethany say. And actually they pick up something which Dr. David Hay and Dr. Rebecca Nye also say, that as well as they're very useful, spirituality is your inner life, your relationships to others, how you stand on the earth, and how you relate to the transcendent. They also say this, that every human being has a spiritual life that's as unique as your thumbprint, as you as your signature. They call that a spiritual signature, or I'll call it a spiritual thumbprint. They say every individual is different in their spiritual life. There are no universal patterns to which we all conform. And that's interesting, isn't it? That I think, without writing a book about it, just by drawing round their hands, Imogen and Bethany have somehow come to that. Here's a challenging question. How will your prayer space installations, how will the prayer space experiences in schools that you set up accommodate all the breadth of diversity that every individual child brings? The second painting I want you to look at is actually from a slightly older child. And at first glance, it looks like one of those art lessons in a Key Stage 1 classroom, doesn't it? Which leave an awful lot of mess at the end. And where the teacher says to the child, "That's lovely, tell me about your picture." Because it's not utterly evident what we're looking at here. But actually, I'll make you laugh, and then the child will make you weep. Because here is a jetty, and some people on the jetty, and this is by 6-year-old Isabel, and it's called His Favourite Place. I painted the jetty, she says. We throw flowers in the water there because my granddad died. It was his favourite place. We think about him, Daddy and Granny and Stella and Hope and me. We pray for him. We say, "I miss you." And you never know, do you? Children walking into your prayer space installation, you never know what deep experience, that's the spirituality of relating to others mostly, isn't it? But a little bit of the transcendent in the prayer point as well. You never know to whom you make the offer of prayer space bring. You don't know what family experience they bring, of loss, of pain, or of gratitude and thankfulness and generosity. And that's a part of accommodating the individual spiritual thumbprint or the individual spiritual signature of every child who might come to take part in what you offer. The third one is a little hard to see as well, but can you spot here, we have actually, it looks like a ladder at first glance, but if you look more closely, you'll see it's a ladder made of bottles. And we have somebody down the bottom here and somebody up the top here, and this is the sky and the tree and the land. What's going on? Well, this is by Adriana Yaya, and she's 7. And she says, I wrote a prayer about the trees on our school playground. They give us shade and they're where lots of insects and birds live. In my picture, I was praying that the trees stay safe and aren't harmed by people picking the leaves, pulling the branches off. I chose a bottle to carry my prayers to God because it had a lid and my prayers wouldn't come out. Actually, that's okay when you're 7, all right? That's fine if you're 7. God can take off the lid of the bottle when he's ready to hear my prayer. When the doves have delivered my prayer, then the bottle can be used again. It's a good idea. I chose green for the colour of my prayer because it is the colour of the trees that I'm praying about. Now, I'm not quite sure I can do this, but I think I can make a fair bet that in this audience today, few of you have prayed as much for trees as Adriana. We've been praying for the trees lately. Maybe I should, because I haven't either. And Adriana's rather deep green spirituality of the earth is also actually a spirituality of the transcendent, isn't it? Because she addresses her concern for the trees on the school playground to God through prayer, sealed in green bottles, carried by doves. Now, I've not seen a better expression of actually a Christian green theology than that, not for a year or more. And I'm rather impressed by the way that Adriana draws attention to something that really, really matters there. Do notice here that you may already have learned from the children, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, and a part of our engagement with schools, one of the things that surprises people doing prayer spaces work for the first time, a part of that engagement says, wow, what do you know? They actually think about stuff. Don't be surprised, brothers and sisters, because in the image of God, of course they do. And would you notice this one as well, please? What spirituality is evident here? What's going on in this image? This young lady has painted a Muslim woman at prayer. She prays on a prayer mat. She titles this work, Even When You Feel Alone, God is With You. And she surrounds the woman who's doing her prayer rak'ahs, her prayer positions as part of the 5-prayer daily cycle that good Muslims try to do. She surrounds her with a kind of half-invisible ribbon that says love all around, support and care. And this, I think, is a piece of work of Small Genius by Amina Yasmin, who is 10. And would you notice this, if you read this as a Christian person, notice how much of it you may find yourself empathizing with and agreeing with. Muslim Amina says, God is always with you. My artwork is all about prayer, and in the picture I tried to make the lady look as though she's very much alone. As she prays, however, God's love and support surrounds and comforts her. My inspiration came from discussion with my teachers, family and friends. Schools and homes can be busy places, so it's good to know that God is always ready to listen when we pray. Doing this work made me think about my commitment to prayer. As I grow up, I try to show my thoughts, my ideas, my feelings, including symbols that are important in my religion, the crescent moon. What I like is the message. Through faith, we're never truly alone. How much of the Muslim 10-year-old's insight is insight for you as a Christian person as well? You'll need, if you're going to use prayer spaces in schools methods, you'll need a theology of the religions. You'll need a theology of plurality to be able to accommodate, to welcome, to properly include those who come to your prayer space whose connection with Christianity is zero, but whose connection with Islam or with Hinduism is strong. And that applies to connecting with the atheist or the questioning somewhere in between atheism and theism youngster as well. Notice, I loved Amina's phrase there. She says, my inspiration came from discussion with who? My teachers. Excellent. But also my family and my friends. That's a very interesting articulation. There's 100 youngsters whose inspiration does come from those 3 sources. For every one who actually admits it, who actually can say it and put it into words. Did Amina teach you anything? Here's the last one I want to show you this morning. I'm going to forgive this youngster for drawing a picture of God. There's no beard, so that helps me, because I don't like God with a beard on the clouds very much. Actually, I'm rather interested by the praying hands down in the bottom right-hand side of this picture. And when you read the text that goes with it, the fact that God is sat on a cloud rather merges into insignificance. what's actually happening here is all about ribbon. The brown ribbons go up from the hands of the young person praying, and the golden ribbon returns from God to the person involved in the prayer. This is what 10-year-old Jessica says about her painting, which is called The First Prayer. I've drawn a picture of when you first say your prayer to God for forgiveness. I've drawn when your tangled life goes up to God and he catches it and renews you, and you get a new, better life. What I like best about my work is it really explains that first prayer. When I was making this, my main thoughts were how happy God must be when people decide to join him. My inspiration from this work came from when I became a Christian. What extraordinary eloquence from a 10-year-old there. What a fantastic expression of the kind of insight that leads to an inspired and Christian theology of prayer, in which the first prayer brings tangled life to God and it's renewed. And I've been praying like that for a long, long time, and it still tangles and renewal for me as well. What a capture of a Christian insight into the practice and theology of prayer. Now, would you notice with me, colleagues, that when prayer spaces in schools arrive with, big baskets of Play-Doh and enormous rolls of duct tape and strings and strings of fairy lights and small collection of branches gathered on the school field, all of that is important for the way that we found, the way that this PSIS movement has discovered of energizing the prayer life of children, young people in schools. That all matters a lot. And a lot of what you'll get today, and you'll love it, will be stuff that says, invest in fairy lights. Play-Doh is really cheap if you buy it at Asda. And those little tips matter quite a lot. But I was asked to talk to you about inspiration and spirituality. And I'm saying this, that every child may be spiritual, and they bring their spirituality with them to school. Don't take God into school. God's busy there already. Go looking for God in school, and you may find what God is doing. And actually, the inspiration for the work that Prayer Spaces in School picks up and runs with doesn't come from the Ofsted definition of spiritual, moral, and social cultural development. That's actually really important just at the moment, because on September the 14th, nationally, the Inspection Service published new guidance for schools about spiritual, moral, social, and cultural development. And although their definition of the spiritual is pretty paltry, it's not very good. My 5 children's pieces of work do a better job of describing spirituality than Ofsted have managed yet. Although Ofsted's description of the spiritual is pretty rough, still, it provides every school, every teacher, a peg, and it says, what are you going to put on that peg? Because when Ofsted come, they're going to ask you, what are you doing for the spiritual development and growth of the pupils in your care? And that's a peg for us if we work in prayer spaces in schools as well, isn't it? Because schools know and are anxious about the nature of the spiritual life that the school offers. So that's important. But actually, when you go into school to work in prayer spaces styles, then your inspiration may come, I think, rather more from the children and young people's spiritual lives than it does from what Ofsted have to say about the nature of spiritual development. And I think that's how it should be, and I think in some ways it's always been like that. Because schools are places of human nurture, then they are places where human spirituality is nurtured. My own inspiration for the work I do in religious education does come first and foremost from children and young people themselves, from what they say, from what they paint, from what they express, from how they choose to live. But there's this as well, isn't there? That inspiration to do your work in prayer spaces might come from your own spiritual practice. And can I just point out to you there that most of us, actually, when we reflect upon our spiritual lives, then we know this, that if our spirituality is any good at all, if it's any use to us, it's good on the worst day of your life. I'm not going to tell you about the worst day of my life, but I know exactly what date it was, and I know what happened, and I know why it was the worst day. And I found out that day that spiritual life was worth more than I knew before that day. And I've known that since the worst day of my life. And can I just kind of make a challenging point there, actually, that if you're mostly and firstly surprised that children are willing at all to engage with the spiritual in school, then push on beyond that, please. One place to go with that, for instance, with teenagers, is that faith in God in teenagers declines. It goes down quite sharply. If you ask them, why did you believe in God when you were 11 and you don't now that you're 16, there are two common answers. One is rubbish. It's that that science has disproved religion, hasn't it? And that's actually just poor religious education that makes pupils unaware that science and religion are compatible according to some religious scientists. They just don't know that. The other reason they give is much better. This is the best reason for being an atheist, isn't it? That why is there any claim to a great God full of love in such a hell of a world? Actually, I love it when this happens, that often it happens in the school classroom with Key Stage 3 kids, that the kids think they're the first one to have ever thought of this. And they say, sir, why would God, if God's supposed to be kind of, loving and powerful, then why do you think there's cancer and starvation and HIV? Eh? And as their teacher, I'm just pleased to be able to tell them, well, it's a good thought, but you're not actually the first person to have ever thought that. But that's the best reason I know for being an atheist, okay? And actually, if you want to engage with young people 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 through your prayer spaces, then don't just let surprise guide you to offer them activities which involve personal reflection on the inner life. Take the full model of spirituality there and do ask with the young people, if there's a great God full of love, why is it such a hell of a world? And you better have some answers to think about with them. No final answers there, but answers along the way. Once I've worked out what I was going to say to you today, I knew I was going to say this, and actually I realized that it wasn't really cash value to say it without trying to demo it. So there's a little prayer spaces installation underneath a rainbow-coloured umbrella in the entrance hall, which I've designed in the last couple of weeks to try and help young people to engage with and reflect on and respond to the question, if there's a great God full of love, why is it such a hell of a world? And if you'd like to try that out for yourself, I shall stand there during breaks during the day, and it'll take you 6 or 7 minutes, but better actually to try it out than to just have a look and compliment me on my nice umbrella. I know the umbrella's nice. Would you try the prayer activity, please? And can I challenge you there that if you're an experienced prayer spaces practitioner, would you consider what have you designed so far? What open windows have you created that enable pupils to tackle the fact that if spiritual life is worth something, it'll be worth something on the worst day of your life? You might also be a prayer spaces practitioner today who has been working with primary age children, or maybe with 11 to 14s. Actually, I think the balance at the moment is that prayer spaces happen most in Key Stage 2, and a lot in Key Stage 3, and not so much with the tiniest children, 4-year-olds, and not so much with 16 to 19s. Yep, there have been a few, but I think that may be right. Here's a challenge for you. What will you do for the next age group up, or the first age group down, from what you've done already? Experienced practitioners there. If you've never done one, start where you fancy. I think that inspiration for your work might also come from the wider Christian community. Would you notice that the Christian practice of worship, the Christian practice of prayer, includes things like the discipline of waiting in prayer? And actually, all our school-age children, 4 to 19, waiting is not something that they're much taught. Instant gratification society and all that. But actually, the Christian practice of waiting in prayer is hallowed by 2,000 years of practice. Here's another one. The Christian practice of penitence and the Christian practice of making restitution for the harm I may have caused. Sometimes saying sorry is a starting point, not a finishing point. The Christian practice of prayer that leads to action is pretty important as well. Prayer, in my experience, the answer that God gives is often an answer given through something that I might do next. And actually, encouraging pupils when they engage with prayer to learn from the Christian practice of putting prayer into action, of prayer for compassion followed by compassionate action, that's a potential source of inspiration for your work as well. I found, and the young lady, Mina, from the Muslim community, I found often inspiration for my work in religious education comes from other communities of faith and belief as well. And listening to Muslims, listening to Jews, listening to atheists, including the 8, 10, 12, 14, 16-year-old atheists and Jews and Muslims who you encounter in your prayer spaces work. That might be a source of inspiration for your work as well. I've shared with you 6 minutes worth of David Hay and Rebecca Nye. And actually, for me, the academic reading around the idea of Christian nurture, but actually also of nurturing human spirituality that Dr. Hay and Dr. Nye have provided as an absolutely powerful, wonderful impetus to developing an understanding of what might be going on when we do these things called prayer spaces in schools. Actually, should I put the Spirit of God there? Not the last on a list, but the one that perhaps runs through the entire list. I would like to say a thank you, because as a religious educator, as someone who meets 3,000 or 4,000 teachers of RE every year, I often now meet teachers, and when I talk to them about the spiritual life of their school, they often mention you lot. I'm a teacher, really, that's what I do. On behalf of the RE teachers that I meet, they mention you with great gratitude, because what you've done, what you are doing, what you're setting yourselves up to do, is to open up the space called school to the Spirit of God in all kinds of new, fresh, creative, dynamic ways. And it meets very, very often the spirituality of the children who connect with you. That's a fantastic thing that you're doing there. And I hope these few thoughts might contribute to doing it with great clarity and with continuing vision and passion. Thank you very much.